It's one thing to see a black bear fishing in a wild Montana river, but it's another to watch him plunge into the icy current for a creature he's supposed to compete with. On the trail camera, the scene lasts less than a minute. Dark fur against white spray, a struggling bobcat caught in the current, and a choice no wild bear should have to make. Most of us think we know how the story ends. We imagine the natural order of predators and pray the instincts that keep them apart. But sometimes the forest writes its own rules, and in those rare moments, we're reminded that species don't bind courage. Before we take you to the riverbank and show you what happened that day, we have to start months earlier, in a quiet corner of Montana where two lives were on a slow, invisible path toward each other, and toward a bond no one thought possible. The first time Ranger Tyler saw the footage, he thought it had to be some kind of mistake. The Kootenai River in early spring is no place for hesitation, fast, cold, and unforgiving. Yet there, in the jittery frames of a trail camera, a massive black bear was wading chest-deep into the surging current. Ahead of him, a bobcat clung desperately to a shifting mat of branches, the river pulling at her with every second. The bear's head was low, his shoulders heaving against the push of the water. One wrong move, and they'd both be gone. It wasn't the kind of scene you expect between wild animals. A black bear in Montana will dig for roots and forage for berries. A bobcat will hunt rabbits, squirrels, and even birds along the shore. Their paths may cross, but rarely do they linger near each other, and rarely in a way that puts one's life at risk for the other. But this was different. You could see it in the way the bear moved, not with the abrupt power of a predator closing in, but with the slow, deliberate motions of something choosing to fight against more than just the river. The camera captured only the essentials, the bear pressing forward inch by inch, the bobcat's ears flat against her head, eyes fixed on her unlikely rescuer. There's a moment just before the bear reaches her when the current surges, lifting them both in a sudden swell. For an instant, they vanish in the white churn. And then somehow, he's got her. Not in his jaws, not in a way that would harm, but braced against his side, nudging her toward the far bank. The recording ends before we see them reach shore. It's the kind of incomplete story that burrows into your mind asking for answers. Why would a wild black bear risk its life for a bobcat? Was it instinct? Was it something more? I've seen my share of remarkable moments in wildlife, an otter sharing food with a young heron, a fox standing guard over an injured owl. But what happened on that river stood apart. There was no food reward, no territorial gain, no obvious survival logic. Only the raw, quiet persistence of one animal refusing to let another disappear. That persistence teaches something simple and easy to miss. Sometimes help doesn't come from where you expect it. Sometimes it's the one you've been taught to avoid, who steps forward in your moment of need. In the wild, survival usually means conserving your strength. Every calorie burned in a rescue is a calorie you can't spend finding food, staying warm, or escaping predators. And yet here was Shadow. That's what the Rangers called him, expending everything he had to keep Sable, the bobcat, alive in a current that could have claimed them both. Watching the footage a second time, you notice small details. The way the bear keeps his head turned slightly toward the bobcat as if checking her position. The way his paw seems to push against the debris to steady her. The deliberate shift of his body into the deeper channel, putting himself between her and the strongest pull of the river. It's the language of action without words. A reminder that compassion, if that's what we dare to call it, doesn't need a common language to be real. Real-life examples like this aren't common, but they do exist. A few years back in Alaska, a brown bear was filmed guiding a moose calf out of a flooded meadow after the mother had been swept away. In Florida, a group of manatees kept a drowning dog afloat until rescuers arrived. These aren't everyday behaviors. They're exceptions that challenge what we think we know about the rules of the wild. And maybe that's the lesson here. Nature is full of patterns, but it's also full of moments that break them. When we think of black bears, we picture them lumbering through forests, turning over logs, or maybe standing tall to sniff the air. When we think of bobcats, we imagine them slipping through the underbrush, silent and alone. But the truth is, both species are more complex than the snapshots we hold in our minds. They navigate overlapping worlds, responding not just to hunger and territory, but to situations we can't always predict. Seeing Shadow and Sable in that river forces you to consider a fresh perspective. Maybe the boundaries we draw predator, competitor, stranger are thinner than we imagine. Maybe survival at its deepest level isn't just about self-preservation, but about keeping the balance of the world around you. After all, in an ecosystem like the one along the Kootenai, every life matters in ways that ripple outward. If Sable had been lost, the rabbits in her range might have multiplied unchecked, affecting vegetation, which in turn shapes the paths of deer and elk. One life connects to another, whether by instinct, by accident, or by an unspoken choice in the middle of a river. Shadow's act didn't just pull Sable from the water, it pulled us, the viewers, into a space where we have to rethink what we believe about wild animals. It reminds us that while black bears and bobcats are both wild animals capable of fierce independence, there are moments when even those boundaries bend. And for us as humans watching from a safe distance, that bending is where the magic happens. It's worth noting that the footage came from a camera meant to track migration patterns, not to catch heroics. The ranger who set it up had been studying how spring melt affects movement along the riverbanks. That day, he ended up recording a story that no data chart could explain. Maybe that's why it lingers. It wasn't staged, it wasn't expected, and it wasn't for us. It just happened in the quiet language of the wild. And if you're willing to look closely, you can find in it a reflection of our own choices, whether to stay on the shore or wade in when someone else is struggling. As the ice broke up along the Kootenai and the days grew longer, the bear and the bobcat would be seen again. Not always together, and never in a way that suggested they'd become companions in the human sense. But the current that nearly took one life had already carried both into a story that was far from over. And like any good story, to understand what happened in that river, you have to go back. Back to before the snow melt, before the rescue, before Shadow and Sable had any reason to trust each other. Because the truth is, this wasn't their first meeting. It was the culmination of months of wary glances, small changes and choices made in silence. That's where our journey begins, not in the rush of the river, but in the stillness of the forest, where two lives were already on a slow, unseen path toward the moment that would bring them together. Evelyn Harper had always imagined retirement as mornings with a cup of tea, afternoons tending a small garden, and evenings listening to the wind move through pine trees. When she and her husband, Daniel Brooks, finally left their decades in Denver behind, they chose a cabin outside Libby, Montana, a place where the Kootenai River curved like a silver ribbon through miles of forest. It was the kind of setting where black bears roamed between stands of huckleberry bobcats, slipped silently along game trails, and bald eagles traced slow circles over the water. They weren't moving into untouched wilderness. Loggers worked in the distance, neighbors lived a few miles down the road, but they were stepping into a community where human and wild animal lives were woven together in quiet, daily ways. Daniel, a retired Forest Service worker, noticed the tracks before Evelyn did. On the first morning after the move, he walked to the riverbank and found fresh prints in the mud, broad, rounded marks of a black bear and the smaller, sharp-edged prints of a bobcat. Two different worlds crossing in the same narrow strip of wet ground. "Looks like we've got company," he told Evelyn over breakfast, and she smiled, thinking it sounded more like a welcome than a warning. In this part of Montana, seeing wildlife isn't unusual, but seeing them often enough to recognize individuals is something else. The local ranger, Tyler, told them about Shadow, a mature male black bear known for his calm behavior around people, and Sable, a female bobcat whose territory hugged the river's edge. Neither was considered aggressive, but both were fiercely independent, especially Sable, who was more rumor than reality for most residents. That first week, Evelyn saw Shadow from the kitchen window, just a dark shape moving between trees, nose down, foraging along the edge of the property. A few days later, Sable appeared at the far side of the meadow, pausing to watch before melting back into the willows. They didn't see each other in the same moment, but the overlap was clear. Here in the Kootenai Valley, territory are like quilt squares stitched together with rivers, ridgelines, and seasonal food sources. Local ecology shapes every step these animals take. In spring, elk and moose browse on the new chutes near the river. River otters fish the shallows and beavers patch their lodges with fresh branches. Coyotes patrol the meadows while owls hunt from low perches at dusk. It's a living, breathing network, and every species has its part. In that web, the black bear and the bobcat aren't enemies, but they aren't companions either. They share space the way strangers share a bus stop, close enough to notice each other, far enough to avoid contact. Evelyn found herself watching for signs, learning to read the language of the land. A fresh scratch on a cedar trunk could mean shadow had passed through. A narrow trail of flattened grass might mark Sable's path to the river. Daniel explained how scent marking worked, bears rubbing their backs on trees to spread their smell and bobcats spraying low vegetation. It's like an invisible bulletin board updated constantly, telling every passerby who's been there and when. One cool April morning, Evelyn caught her first glimpse of both in the same frame. Shadow had wandered down to the water's edge to fish his dark fur a mirror of the storm clouds above. Sable crouched 50 yards away, half hidden in the grass, her body still, but her eyes locked on him. There was no growl, no rush forward, just a long, measuring stare. After a moment, she turned and walked away. It seemed like nothing, but to Evelyn it was the start of something. In the wild, most meetings between predators end quickly, either with one leaving or one chasing the other off. The fact that Sable chose to leave without confrontation meant she'd decided the bear wasn't worth the risk. A small decision, but decisions like that stack over time, shaping patterns we can't see until much later. It reminded Evelyn of something she'd once told her students, that trust isn't built in grand gestures, but in small, consistent moments where nothing bad happens. Real-life examples back that up. In Yellowstone, researchers have documented wolves and grizzly bears foraging within sight of each other, neither pushing the other away. In Florida, alligators and herons have been seen nesting in proximity year after year, each benefiting from the other's presence in subtle ways. Coexistence in the wild isn't about friendship as we define it, it's about calculated tolerance. And that's where the fresh perspective comes in. In human terms, we often assume that not acting is a lack of connection. In nature, not acting, choosing not to chase, not to fight, can be the first step towards something deeper. Over the next few months, Evelyn and Daniel kept seeing signs. Shadow would leave fish scraps near a particular bend in the river. A day or two later, Sable's tracks would appear nearby. It wasn't sharing in the deliberate sense, but it was an overlap without conflict, and that matters in the language of the wild. Ranger Tyler, who'd been studying wildlife behavior in the area for years, explained it this way. Sometimes animals figure out that there's more to gain by not pushing each other out. Less energy spent fighting means more energy for surviving. And now and then that tolerance opens the door to something you wouldn't expect. Evelyn wrote that down in her journal, underlining it twice. The idea that a wild black bear and a solitary bobcat could become something more than neighbors seemed far-fetched, but then so did moving to Montana after a lifetime in the city. As spring gave way to early summer, the rhythms of the valley deepened. Shadow moved between berry patches and the river, his fur often dusted with pollen from wildflowers. Sable was harder to spot, but Evelyn learned to look for the faint line of her back through tall grass, the flick of her ears above the meadow. Sometimes the bear's trail would pass within a few feet of hers, their worlds brushing without touching. Each time, Evelyn wondered if they noticed the closeness as much as she did. There's a lesson in paying attention to these quiet overlaps. In our own lives, it's easy to overlook the people, or in this case, the species that move alongside us without making noise. We forget that change often starts here in the unnoticed spaces where nothing happens, but everything is preparing to. The fresh perspective comes when you realize that coexistence isn't passive, it's an active choice, repeated again and again, even when instinct says to turn away. By late June, Evelyn and Daniel had settled fully into their new routines. Mornings meant coffee on the porch. Evenings meant walks along the river. And always there was the chance of seeing Shadow or Sable, each citing a small reminder that they weren't alone in their little piece of the valley. They didn't yet know how intertwined those two animals' paths would become, or how a single moment months later would transform quiet tolerance into a story that would ripple far beyond Montana. But the groundwork was already being laid in every shared patch of ground, every unchallenged crossing, every decision to simply let the other be. And like all stories worth telling, this one was about to shift from quiet observation to something that would demand action. By mid-July, Evelyn and Daniel had learned enough about their new neighbors to tell when the rhythm was off. On most mornings, Shadow's wide black bear tracks would appear along the riverbank, heavy and deliberate. Sable's bobcat prints were lighter, weaving in and out of the willows. But one week, those patterns shifted. The prints overlapped more often, sometimes in the same patch of wet sand, and there were signs of hesitation, a half-circle of paw marks where one had stopped, abruptly turned and left. Ranger Tyler explained that this was the season when food draws animals closer together. The huckleberries on the south slope were ripening, and the fish in the shallows were easier to catch in low water. For a black bear like Shadow, that meant roaming more widely. For a bobcat like Sable, it meant hunting the edges of the river, where small mammals came to drink. Their territories, once loosely aligned, were pressing against each other. In the wild, territory is more than a map, it's a survival contract. Black bears maintain loose home ranges overlapping with others of their kind, and sometimes with different species. Bobcats are more rigid, marking and defending their space with scent and scratch marks. When those lines blur, tension follows. Evelyn saw it one afternoon from the porch. Shadow was moving along the far side of the meadow, head down foraging. Sable emerged from the willows, her body low, tail flicking. She didn't run, but every muscle was tight. Shadow stopped, lifted his head, and for a long moment they just stared. No charge, no growl, just a silent exchange neither human could interpret. Then Sable slipped back into the trees and Shadow moved on. It was over in less than a minute, but Evelyn's heart was still beating fast. Real-life examples of such moments don't always end peacefully. In the Adirondacks, researchers have documented bobcats abandoning prime hunting areas for weeks after a black bear encounter. In Alaska, brown bears have been known to drive wolves away from salmon runs. The lesson is simple: proximity doesn't guarantee peace. Coexistence can teeter on the edge, and one wrong step can tip it into open conflict. Daniel, who'd spent years in the Forest Service, explained it in human terms. It's like living next to someone you don't know. You share a fence line. Some days you nod, some days you pretend not to see each other. But if one of you starts trimming the other's hedge without asking, that's where trouble starts. In nature, the hedge is food, shelter, and safety. For Shadow, a berry patch might mean weeks of easy calories. For Sable, a cluster of vole burrows could feed her for days. Each knows exactly where those resources are, and each has learned to defend them. Yet, that summer, neither seemed willing to escalate beyond cautious standoffs. The fresh perspective here is that restraint is a form of strength. In human stories, we tend to glorify action, making the first move, staking a claim. But in the wild, survival often favors the one who waits, who measures, who lets a potential fight dissolve into nothing. Evelyn began to notice smaller signs of this restraint. Sable would skirt the edge of the berry patch, taking only the lower bushes. Shadow, in turn, would avoid fishing the narrow channel where Sable hunted. These were choices, however, instinct-driven, that kept the peace. And maybe Evelyn thought this was how two very different creatures could share the same space without breaking it apart. Still, the tension was there, like the low hum of a distant storm. One day in August, Daniel found deep claw marks on a pine near the river. Black bears often mark trees to signal dominance or claim a feeding area. A few yards away, a fresh bobcat spray marked the base of a willow. It was as if each had signed their name on the land, one above the other. They're both making sure the other knows they're not backing down, Daniel said. That visual stuck with Evelyn, two signatures separate but layered, each visible to the other. It made her think about how often we live in shared spaces without truly understanding the lives moving alongside ours. In nature, those layers of presence are constant. Elk pass through bear trails, coyotes follow deer tracks, raptors hunt over rivers where otters fish. The Kootenai Valley holds dozens of such overlaps, each a quiet negotiation. Ranger Tyler shared a story from years earlier, a black bear and a mountain lion using the same ridge. The bear would travel by day, the lion by night. Neither avoided it completely, but neither forced the other out. They didn't need to like each other, he said. They just needed the ridge more than they needed the fight. That idea, needing the space more than the conflict, applied perfectly to Shadow and Sable. The river, the meadow, the berry patches. These weren't luxuries, they were lifelines. Pushing the other out could mean losing access to essential resources. So they danced at the edges of each other's range, careful, measured, waiting. The small lesson here for us is about boundaries. We often think of boundaries as walls meant to keep others out. But in healthy systems, whether human neighborhoods or wild ecosystems, boundaries are also agreements. They say, "This is mine, that is yours, and if we both respect that, we can thrive." For Evelyn and Daniel, watching this unspoken agreement unfold was as humbling as it was fascinating. They began to see the meadow and riverbank not as their backyard, but as a shared space with its own rules. And the more they respected those rules, the more welcome they felt in the valley. By September, food was plentiful and tensions eased. Shadow fed heavily to prepare for winter. Sable ranged farther along the river, following the movement of prey. The overlap became less frequent, but the awareness remained. When one crossed the other's path, it was acknowledged a pause, a glance, and then a return to the task at hand. Evelyn sensed that something was shifting, though she couldn't have said what. It was as if the distance between them, carefully maintained for months, was not quite as rigid as before. And she wondered, in a quiet, hopeful way, whether this slow dance of territory and tension was moving towards something else. She wouldn't have to wait long to find out. Because the next time Shadow and Sable met by the river, it wouldn't end with a glance and a retreat. It would end in a way that neither Evelyn, nor Daniel, nor Ranger Tyler, nor anyone who saw the footage could have predicted. By late February, the Kootenay River had narrowed under a skin of ice, but the current beneath was still fierce. Snow piled high against the cabin porch rails, and the sound of wind rushing down from the Cabinet Mountains carried through the valley. Evelyn and Daniel were used to winter by then, but this storm felt different, wilder, heavier, as if the air itself had weight. They stayed close to the fire, while the snow came sideways, blurring the pines into ghost shapes. For 2 days, neither Shadow nor Sable appeared. Then, on the third afternoon, the storm eased just enough for Daniel to step outside and check the trail cameras. What he found would stay with him for the rest of his life. The footage began with Sable moving along the river's edge, her paws sinking into soft drifts. She was hunting head low, body smooth, following the darting trail of a snowshoe hare. The hare veered toward the ice where the river bent sharply. Sable lunged, but the ground gave way beneath her, a sheet of ice, breaking free and spinning into the current. In an instant, she was in the water, thrashing her fur, flattening against the cold. The temperature of that water was barely above freezing. For a bobcat, it was more than just unpleasant, it was deadly. Felines have an ingrained fear of water. For good reason, their bodies aren't built for it. Dense fur traps water, pulling it down. Cold saps their strength in seconds. Wildlife biologist Dr. Marcus Hill, who later analyzed the footage, explained that bobcats rarely swim unless forced by necessity. "It's not just discomfort," he said. "It's biology. Their survival strategies evolved on land. In water, they're in a foreign world where every instinct tells them to get out or die." On the camera's edge, another figure appeared. Shadow, his black fur dusted with snow. Bears in Montana don't always hibernate through winter, especially in milder years. Shadow had been foraging, likely searching for exposed roots or carrion along the bank. The moment he saw Sable, he stopped. There's no way to know what went through his mind, but the camera caught his head lifting his ears forward, and then without hesitation, he stepped onto the ice. Ice cracked under his weight, plunging him into the same freezing water. This wasn't a calculated move to claim food or territory. Sable wasn't prey. She was drowning. The bear's head lowered his paws, breaking through the slush as he moved toward her. The current pulled them both downstream, but Shadow's sheer size gave him an edge. He reached her, pressing his body against hers to keep her from slipping under. Instead of dragging her in his jaws, he used his shoulder to guide her toward a section of the bank where snow had piled low. She clawed at the ice, slipped, and tried again. Shadow braced himself, pushing until she scrambled onto the edge, her sides heaving. In the footage, she doesn't run. She stands there, dripping, looking back at him. He hauls himself onto the bank a few moments later, shaking water from his coat in a spray that catches the pale light. Then they both walk away in opposite directions, disappearing into the storm. Real-life examples of predator and prey breaking their roles are rare, but not unheard of. In 2019 in British Columbia, a trail camera recorded a cougar guiding her cubs around a feeding black bear instead of attacking, a decision that likely spared both sides from injury. In Alaska, a polar bear was seen nudging an exhausted sled dog to shore after it fell into a meltwater channel. These moments don't rewrite the laws of nature, but they remind us that those laws have room for choice. The small lesson here is about instinct and decision. Instinct is what tells a bobcat to avoid water, what tells a bear to conserve energy in winter. Decision is what happens when an animal steps outside that instinct, however briefly. For humans, it's easy to assume animals act purely from hardwired responses, but now and then you see behavior that suggests something more: awareness, risk-taking, even care. The fresh perspective comes when you realize that the survival of one can depend on the unexpected action of another, even across species. Shadow gained nothing tangible from pulling Sable from the river. If anything, he lost precious energy and body heat in the middle of winter, yet he did it anyway. Ranger Tyler, when he saw the footage, shook his head in quiet disbelief. "I've worked these forests for 20 years, and I've never seen a black bear do that for another predator. You can explain some of it by proximity, by curiosity, but not all of it. Sometimes they surprise you." For Evelyn and Daniel, watching the playback on their small monitor, it felt like a glimpse into a private corner of the wild, a place where the rules bend just enough for a life to be saved. They didn't tell many people at first, unsure how to explain what they'd witnessed without it sounding like a campfire story. But the images stayed with them, and in the weeks that followed, they began to notice changes. Sable no longer bolted at the sight of Shadow. She lingered at the edge of the meadow. If he was nearby, her body relaxed, ears upright. Shadow, for his part, seemed less indifferent to her presence. If they crossed paths along the river, he would pause, lift his head, and then go back to whatever he was doing. These were small shifts, almost invisible unless you'd been watching for months. But they marked a turning point. The icy water of that February storm had carried them both into something neither could have found alone. And as winter loosened its grip on the Kootenai, that connection born in danger would find new ground in the slow unfolding days of spring. What neither Evelyn nor Daniel could have guessed was that the rescue they'd just seen would not be the last. The weeks after the winter storm brought a quiet shift to the valley. Snow melted back from the riverbanks, revealing damp earth and the first shoots of willow. Evelyn and Daniel noticed it before they could name it, a different rhythm in the way Shadow and Sable moved through their shared territory. They still kept a cautious distance, but the tension of last summer had softened. It began with a simple overlap. In March, the trail cameras caught Sable crouched near the water, watching trout swirl in a shallow pool. 40 yards upstream, Shadow fished in his usual spot, the two framed in the same still shot. No flinch, no retreat, just an acknowledgement of space. By April, those moments were happening more often. Sometimes Shadow would pass within sight of her and pause briefly, lifting his head as if to mark her presence, then continue. Sable began taking longer routes along the riverbank paths that mirrored his foraging trails. Ranger Tyler told them this kind of parallel movement wasn't unheard of when food was abundant. "They're not cooperating," he said, "but they're also not wasting energy driving each other away. That's how tolerance starts." The 6-month transformation was subtle but clear. Evelyn kept a small notebook where she logged the dates and sightings. In March, Sable at the meadow edge, shadow fishing. April, proximity. No reaction. May, Sable resting in the sun while Shadow eats berries nearby. June, shared foraging 40 minutes apart, same patch. She added her small observations, how Sable's posture had changed from wary to calm, how Shadow's movements near her had lost the slow circling of caution. A real-life parallel came from Yellowstone, where researchers documented a female grizzly and a wolf pack using the same carcass site over several weeks. Neither tried to chase the other off. Instead, they fed at different times of day. It wasn't friendship in human terms, but it was a form of coexistence that benefited both. The small lesson here is that bonds, whether between people or animals, often grow in the quiet repetition of safe encounters. Trust isn't built in a single dramatic rescue as remarkable as that winter moment had been. It's built in the days after, when each meeting ends without harm. In May, Evelyn saw something she'd never expected. She was weeding her small garden when movement caught her eye. Across the meadow, Shadow sat on his haunches near the water, his head turned towards Sable. She was batting at a clump of grass the way domestic cats will tease a toy. It wasn't play in the human sense, there was no back and forth, but she was comfortable enough to focus on something other than him. He stayed where he was watching without approaching. That image stayed with Evelyn, two predators, each in their world, yet sharing a moment of calm, so rare in the wild. The fresh perspective comes when you realize that relationships even across species aren't defined solely by dramatic acts. They're shaped in the in-between moments, the unremarkable hours where nothing threatens and nothing demands. By late June, Evelyn's camera caught what she would later call the first gesture. Shadow had pulled a salmon from the river and carried it a few feet up the bank. He ate most of it, then left the rest and walked away. Later that day, Sable approached the spot and took the scraps. Was it intentional sharing? Ranger Tyler was careful with his words. It could be a coincidence, but it's also true that some animals leave food behind in a way that benefits others. Whether that's generosity or just habit, that's the part we can't measure. Evelyn didn't care about the measurement. To her, it was another stitch in the invisible thread between them. The bond's progress could be traced almost like a calendar. March, parallel presence. April, reduced tension. May, comfort in shared space. June, indirect exchange. Each step, however small, mattered. It reminded Evelyn of a time when she'd worked with students who didn't trust her at first. She'd learned to build trust, not by asking for it, but by showing up every day without breaking it. By July, summer's abundance was in full swing. Berries, fish, small game, all plentiful. The camera caught Sable lounging in the shade while Shadow foraged nearby. In one sequence, she even moved closer to watch him turn over a log in search of insects, then settled back down without alarm. Ranger Tyler saw the footage and smiled. "She's curious," he said. Curiosity's a sign she's not seeing him as a threat anymore. And then came the moment Evelyn had waited for without knowing it. It was a warm afternoon in early August. On the far side of the river, Shadow was fishing in the shallows. Sable appeared at the water's edge, not to hunt, but to watch. He glanced up at her, then returned to his task. When he caught a fish, he moved toward her side of the bank, stopping several yards short. She approached cautiously, sniffed the air, then backed away. No chase, no fear. Just two lives meeting in a way that seemed almost deliberate. The fresh perspective here is that coexistence, when nurtured, can grow into something resembling companionship, but not the human version with shared goals and spoken agreements, but a wild equivalent, an ongoing choice to allow the other's presence. It's easy to forget that this choice costs something. For Shadow, allowing Sable near meant tolerating another predator in his feeding space. For Sable, it meant trusting a creature 10 times her size not to harm her. Both took a risk, however calculated. The valley's wildlife network was still what it had always been. Elk grazing in the meadows, otters slipping through the current, eagles circling above, but somewhere within it, a black bear and a bobcat had carved out a small exception to the usual rules. Evelyn didn't need science to tell her it was unusual. She could see it in the way their movements began to align, not by accident, but by a pattern she could feel as much as she could record. What none of them knew then was that this pattern was leading toward another moment on the river. And this time the current would be stronger, the stakes higher, and the choice far more dangerous than before. By early September, the Kootenai had taken on that restless look it gets before autumn rains. Days were still warm, but the nights had turned cool enough to pull a faint mist off the water in the mornings. Evelyn and Daniel had seen Shadow and Sable together more than once that month, never close enough to touch, but close enough that the sight no longer felt rare. It was a sign of how far they'd come. The storm that changed everything started without warning. Heavy clouds rolled in from the west, dropping a steady rain that swelled the river in hours. The normally calm channel behind the meadow became a rush of dark water laced with debris. Fallen branches spun past, carried by a current far stronger than it looked from the bank. Sable was the first to appear. Evelyn spotted her from the porch, pacing the far side of the riverbank, eyes locked on something in the shallows. Later, Daniel guessed she was after fish driven close to shore by the rising water. She found a narrow log jam where driftwood had piled into a natural bridge and began to cross. From a distance, it looked solid, but in the middle, the logs shifted the pile, giving way under her weight. In an instant, she was in the river. Cold shock stiffened her movements. The current caught her, pulling her toward a deeper water. Bobcats can swim if they have to, but in flood conditions, even a short crossing can be deadly. Their heavy fur soaks fast, dragging them under. Their small bodies lose heat far quicker than a bear or an otter. Evelyn and Daniel froze helpless from across the meadow. They were too far to reach her, too close to look away. And then Shadow appeared. He came from the willows downstream, head high, scanning the bank. Whether he'd been foraging or resting nearby, no one knew. What they did know was that the moment he saw her, he moved. Black bears are powerful swimmers, using a steady side stroke to cross lakes and rivers. But this wasn't a calm swim, it was a battle. The current was so strong, it lifted him sideways, pushing against every stride. His head dipped under more than once, then surfaced again, eyes fixed on the struggling bobcat. When he reached her, she was barely keeping her head above water, her movements jerky, almost spent. He swung his body toward her, using his bulk to block the current and push her toward the nearest eddy. The water foamed around them, but slowly they made ground. Real-life rescues like this are rare, but not without precedent. In Alaska's Kenai Peninsula, a brown bear was once filmed nudging a moose calf toward shore after it had been swept from its mother. In Yellowstone, a bison was seen positioning itself between a drowning elk calf and the current until the calf could scramble onto a gravel bar. These acts defy the usual predator-prey script, and each one leaves more questions than answers. The small lesson here is that in moments of crisis, survival can sometimes depend on unexpected alliances. Shadow could have ignored Sable's struggle. After all, she wasn't part of his survival plan. Yet something in that moment tipped the balance toward action. When they reached the calmer water near the bank, Sable clawed at the muddy edge, slipping twice before finding purchase. Shadow stayed in the water until she was clear, his head turning toward her one last time before he hauled himself out. Evelyn would later say it was that pause that made her believe this wasn't just instinct, it was recognition. The fresh perspective comes when you realize that connections, even in the wild, are tested not in the easy days of plenty, but in the sudden storms that strip away routine. The rescue in February had been dramatic, but this was different, faster water, less margin for error, and a bear willingly putting himself between a predator and the force of the river. From the porch, Evelyn and Daniel could see them both standing on the bank, soaked and still. Sable's fur clung in dark spikes to her frame, her breath visible in quick bursts. Shadow shook once, sending a spray into the rain-heavy air, then turned away toward the willows. Sable didn't follow, but she didn't run either. She sat for a long while, watching him disappear. Ranger Tyler, when shown the camera footage, later leaned back in his chair. You can say it's curiosity or chance or some instinct we don't understand. But I've seen enough to know that sometimes the explanation is simply that they choose to act. And that choice is what changes everything. In the days after the river emergency, Evelyn noticed another change. Sable began appearing closer to the cabin, not to scavenge, but to rest in the open meadow where Shadow often foraged. When he came by, she stayed put, lifting her head but not moving away. It was a small thing, but in the language of the wild, it spoke volumes. The bond they had been building quietly, slowly over months, had now weathered 2 storms, and somewhere in that shared history, predator and competitor had become something harder to name. What neither Evelyn nor Daniel realized then was that the story wasn't over. The next chapter wouldn't be about survival in water, but about living side by side on land, an even greater challenge for 2 creatures born to keep their distance. The days after the second rescue carried a quiet clarity. Evelyn and Daniel still saw Shadow and Sable at the meadow's edge. But now the sightings felt less like coincidence and more like a pattern, two animals choosing the same spaces without tension, without hurry. For Evelyn, this was the part of the story that made her think most about what it means to share a home with wildlife. Living here wasn't just about enjoying the view of the Kootenai River or hearing an eagle's cry over the valley. It was about understanding that the same meadow where she planted her tomatoes was also part of Shadow's feeding grounds, and that the willow thickets were Sable's hunting corridors. This wasn't a backyard in the city. It was a thread in a living ecosystem. Coexistence, she realized, began with boundaries, not the fences and gates of human design, but the invisible agreements that allowed two worlds to overlap without clashing. For her and Daniel, it meant simple things: keeping trash secure, never feeding wildlife, and leaving berry patches untouched in late summer so bears could fatten for winter. For Shadow and Sable, it meant something harder: to define a mutual decision to tolerate and maybe even trust a presence that could have been a threat. Real-life examples like theirs can be found across North America. In Florida, homeowners have learned to coexist with black bears by removing food attractants and using bear-proof bins, reducing conflicts dramatically. In Wyoming, ranchers have worked with conservationists to install low-voltage fencing around calving pastures, protecting livestock without harming grizzlies. These efforts show that when humans respect the needs of wild animals, both sides benefit. The small lesson here is that safety is not the absence of contact, it's the presence of respect. Just as Shadow and Sable learned to share the same riverbank without chasing each other away, people can share land with wildlife if they're willing to adapt. Evelyn began thinking about their property differently. She and Daniel created a wildlife corridor by leaving a strip of the meadow unmowed, giving smaller animals cover as they moved between the forest and the river. They cleared fallen branches from the edges of the river path to make escape routes easier for deer and moose. They even placed a few large rocks near the steepest bank sections so smaller creatures could climb out if they fell in. It reminded her of something Ranger Tyler had said after the second rescue. "You can't make the wild safe, but you can make it safer." That principle applied to water as much as land. Tyler encouraged them to treat the river the way some pet owners treat backyard pools, with simple safeguards. "If you live near water," he said, "think of it like this. Keep an open sight line from the house to the bank. Clear debris that could trap an animal in the current. Create at least one low exit point. Avoid blocking wildlife access entirely. They need water to survive. Use trail cameras to monitor activity. Knowing who visits can help you predict potential hazards." These steps weren't complicated, but they could mean the difference between life and death for an animal caught in a bad situation. The fresh perspective here is that coexistence is not passive. It's active care, making choices every day that recognize the needs of others, even if those others walk on four legs and avoid eye contact. It's about prevention as much as reaction, about reducing the chances that rescue will ever be necessary. Evelyn found herself noticing more than just Shadow and Sable. A family of otters began using the back channel again after she cleared old fencing wire from the shallows. A pair of great blue herons nested nearby, undisturbed by human movement, because the couple kept their distance. In the same way that Shadow and Sable had learned to navigate each other's presence, Evelyn and Daniel were learning to move through their land with intention. One evening, they sat with Ranger Tyler on the porch, watching the sun fade over the river. He told them about bobcat conservation status in the region, stable for now, but vulnerable to habitat loss and vehicle collisions. Black bears, too, were doing well in Montana, but increasing development near wild corridors could change that quickly. The more people see animals as part of their neighborhood instead of an intrusion, he said, the better their chances. That sentiment stayed with Evelyn. It reframed the rescues not as isolated miracles, but as reminders of what's possible when survival doesn't have to be a zero-sum game. In nature, every choice ripples outward. When Shadow spared his energy to pull Sable from the river twice, he didn't just change her life. He changed the way she moved through her territory, the places she felt safe to rest, the risks she was willing to take. And in turn, that altered the landscape for everything in her range, from rabbits to songbirds. Coexistence isn't always dramatic. Sometimes it's just a bear leaving berries on the bush, or a bobcat avoiding a fishing spot because someone else is there. But in those small, unspoken decisions lies the same principle that saved Sable's life, choosing not to harm when you have the power to do so. For Evelyn, the next part of their story would be about leaning into that principle, creating a home that wasn't just theirs, but belonged to every creature that needed it. The meadow, the river, the thickets. They were all part of a shared map now. And as autumn settled over the valley, that map would become the backdrop for one final, unforgettable season together. A year to the day after the second rescue, Evelyn woke to the sound of rain on the cabin roof. Not the hard, cold rain of a September storm, but the soft kind that hangs in the air like a veil. She stepped out onto the porch, coffee in hand, and watched a thin mist drift over the Kootenai River. Across the meadow, Shadow moved with his slow, deliberate gait toward the water's edge. A few minutes later, Sable emerged from the willows, pausing just long enough to check the air before walking down to join him. There was no tension in her posture, no edge to her movement. She simply settled a few yards away and began to groom the wet fur along her back. It struck Evelyn then that this was their day. Rescue day. Not because they needed saving now, but because it marked the moment their shared story became something more than survival. She called softly for Daniel, and together they stood on the porch, silent witnesses to a picture they could never have imagined when they first moved here. It's easy to think of a rescue as an isolated act, a single moment when one life changes another. But living here had taught them that rescues have echoes. The winter storm, the flood, the silent agreements in between each had shaped the way these two animals now moved through the valley. Shadow still foraged with the steady focus of a black bear preparing for winter. Sable still hunted with the quick precision of a bobcat. Yet their paths crossed now without hesitation, and more than once, Evelyn had seen them foraging in parallel as if the riverbank belonged to them both. In a way it did. Real-life examples of this kind of sustained bond are rare in the wild. Wildlife biologists sometimes document temporary associations like dolphins traveling with porpoises for a season or crows forming alliances with coyotes during hunts. But these relationships usually dissolve when the conditions change. What made Shadow and Sable different was the way their connection seemed to grow stronger after the immediate threat was gone. The lesson here is that trust once earned can outlast the moment that created it. In human terms, it's the difference between helping someone once and becoming part of each other's lives. The knowledge Evelyn and Daniel gained from watching them was as much about people as it was about wildlife. They learned that respect creates space for connection, that safety comes from understanding boundaries, and that sometimes the truest bonds are built without words or obligation. The emotional weight of that knowledge wasn't lost on them. Every time they saw Shadow lift his head to acknowledge Sable or Sable rest without watching him warily, it reminded them of the fragile, deliberate nature of peace. It's a choice renewed every day. The fresh perspective comes when you realize that the wild isn't as separate from us as we imagine. The same principles that allowed a black bear and a bobcat to share a riverbank respect-restraint presence are the ones that allow us to live alongside each other. We think of wild animals as being ruled entirely by instinct, but here was proof that they could choose something different when the moment demanded it. And if they could, maybe we could too. Later that afternoon, the rain cleared and the valley lit up under a pale autumn sun. Evelyn and Daniel walked to the riverbank, careful not to disturb the two figures still lingering near the water. Shadow had found a patch of berries and was eating methodically while Sable watched from a moss-covered log. A light breeze carried the smell of wet earth and ripe fruit. Evelyn thought of all the ways this story could have gone differently. How either rescue might have failed. How fear could have won out over trust. How neither might have survived the last winter without the other's intervention. And she thought of how in those crucial moments both had chosen the harder path to act, to risk to save. As the sun dipped behind the trees, Shadow ambled toward the willows. Sable followed at a distance, and in a few moments, they were gone. The meadow was empty again, but it didn't feel empty. It felt held by memory, by meaning, by the understanding that what they had witnessed over the past year was something rare and worth protecting. Standing there, Evelyn realized that Rescue Day wasn't just theirs. It belonged to anyone willing to see the wild, not as something separate, but as something we're all connected to. It belonged to anyone who believed that survival doesn't have to mean standing alone. And maybe most of all, it belonged to those moments, human or animal, when we step beyond what's expected and choose to care anyway. As you've watched Shadow and Sable's story unfold, you've probably felt it too, that pull towards something both ancient and new. It's in the way their paths shifted from tension to trust, in the way danger became a bridge instead of a wall. And it's in the way their lives remind us of our own, that every day we have the chance to rescue, to protect, to choose connection over fear. So before you click away, take a moment to think about your own rescue days. Who have you pulled from a current in ways big or small? Who has pulled you? And how might you carry those choices forward? If this story has stayed with you, if it's given you something worth holding on to, I'd love for you to stay connected here. Like this video, subscribe to the channel and share it with someone who might need a reminder that even in the wild, and maybe especially there, unexpected bonds can change everything.